The man who wrote The Outlaw Josey Wales once wrote 4 other words that shocked a nation. Segregation now, segregation forever. And that is only the 3rd strangest thing about this movie. Because the gentle love story humming under every scene. It started on this set and ended 13 years later behind locked doors and a courtroom. And the kindly old director who set it all in motion was fired before the picture was half finished. In a scandal so ugly that Hollywood passed a brand new law to stop it ever happening again. A war hero rides alone, spitting tobacco on a stray dog, refusing to die. But the real story, the one nobody told you, happened off the screen. Before we count it down, tell me in the comments, do you think a film can still be great when the truth behind it is this dark? Keep that question in your head, because by number 1, you may change your answer. These are the Outlaw Josey Wales, stories no one believed until they heard the whole thing. Let's start counting. Number 1, the author was a Klansman in disguise. Start with the secret at the very heart of this movie, because it is almost too strange to be true. The Outlaw Josey Wales was based on a 1972 novel called The Rebel Outlaw. Josey Wales, later republished as Gone to Texas. It was written by a soft-spoken cowboy named Forrest Carter, who told everyone he was a storyteller to the Cherokee Nation. A man who had lived rough on horseback and learned his tales around campfires. He went on television. He spoke in a slow Texas drawl. He wore a cowboy hat and kept his eyes low. It was all a lie. Every word of it. Forrest Carter was really Asa Earl Carter, and Asa Earl Carter was one of the most violent racists in the American South. In the 1950s, he ran a radio program in Birmingham, Alabama, that was so hateful he was fired from it. He founded his own breakaway Ku Klux Klan group, a secret strike force whose members carried out savage beatings. And here is the part that stops people cold. Asa Carter was a speechwriter for the segregationist governor George Wallace. He is widely credited with writing the most infamous line of that whole dark era of American history. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. When his political career collapsed, this man vanished and reinvented himself. He took the first name Forrest, after the Confederate general who became the Klan's first leader. He lost weight, grew a mustache, claimed to be part Cherokee, and started calling his own sons his nephews. Then he sat down and wrote a Western about a grieving man who finds a new family among Native and makes peace with a Comanche chief. A real Clansman wrote a story preaching brotherhood between peoples. And nobody on Eastwood's production had any idea. The original director, Philip Kaufman, sensed something poisonous in the book's politics. But the truth was beyond anyone's guess. So if the gentle heart of this movie was written by one of the cruelest men of his generation, what other lies were hiding behind the camera? Number 2, the love story that ended in a courtroom. Watch the way Josey Wales looks at the young woman named Laura Lee, and you are watching something real begin. The actress was Sondra Locke. She had already earned an Academy Award nomination years earlier for her very first film, and she had auditioned for Eastwood once before, without getting the part. This time she got it, even though, at 32, she was a full decade older than the girl she was playing. She wanted the role so badly that she took a brutal pay cut, earning about $18,000, less than half her usual salary, just for the exposure. Out in the desert near Page, Arizona, in the autumn of 1975, she and Clint Eastwood fell for each other hard. By her own account, they were nearly living together, from the very first days of filming. What almost no one in the audience ever knew was the tangle behind it. Eastwood was still married, and Locke herself was married too, to a childhood friend. In an arrangement she would keep going for years. That romance, the one you can feel flickering in every quiet scene between them, lasted roughly 13 years and 6 films. And it did not end gently. It ended in lawsuits, in accusations of locked doors, and a Bel Air home she could no longer enter. In a legal war over a Hollywood deal she said was designed to push her aside. The woman smiling shyly at Josey Wales on a wagon would one day write a memoir laying it all bare. It is one of the great Hollywood love stories and one of its ugliest endings, and it all started on this set. But that desert romance had a casualty almost no one talks about, a man who lost his job because of it. Who was he? Number 3. Eastwood fired his own director and Hollywood passed a law. Here is the scandal that changed the rules of the movie business. The Outlaw Josey Wales was supposed to be directed by Philip Kaufman, a gifted, careful filmmaker who would later make The Right Stuff. Kaufman co-wrote the shooting script. He cast Chief Dan George. He did nearly all the heavy lifting of preparation. But Kaufman worked slowly, with a perfectionist's patience, and Clint Eastwood was the fastest, most efficient man in Hollywood. The two styles ground against each other like stones, and there was something else. Both men had been drawn to Sondra Locke, and the tension over her only sharpened the conflict on set. The breaking point, as the story has long been told, came one evening when Kaufman stepped away to track down a small prop. While he was gone, Eastwood ordered the cameras to roll and grabbed the shot before the light died, then left before the director got back. Not long after, on a day in late October 1975, only about 3 weeks into filming, the producer delivered the news on Eastwood's orders. Kaufman was fired. Eastwood took over and directed the rest himself, finishing on time and on budget. The Directors Guild of America was furious. A powerful star had thrown out his director and taken the chair for himself. So the Guild created a new regulation, one that still exists today, and they named it after the man who caused it. They call it the Eastwood Rule. It says that, except in true emergency, no one already working on a film can replace its fired director, which means an actor or producer can never again do exactly what Eastwood did here. Eastwood was reportedly hit with a heavy fine over it. Eastwood himself called it the worst moment of his life, and said he had never fired anyone before. The irony? He went on to become one of the most honored directors in that very guild's history. So Eastwood took command of his own picture. But the most magical performance in the entire film came from a 77-year-old man who could barely remember his lines. How on earth did they pull it off? 4. The old chief who couldn't remember his lines. If you have seen this movie, you remember Lone Watty, the weary, witty old Cherokee who rides at Josey's side and delivers some of the funniest, most touching lines in the whole picture. He was played by Chief Dan George, a real hereditary chief of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in Canada. And here is something most people never realize. He did not become a professional actor until he was around 60 years old. A few years before Josey Wales, he had earned an Academy Award nomination for Little Big Man, becoming one of the first Indigenous actors the Academy ever recognized. But by the time he made this film, he was 77, and memorizing pages of dialogue had become nearly impossible for him. Most directors would have seen a problem. Eastwood saw a treasure, and he invented a trick to protect it. As he later explained, he would simply say the lines together with the old chief several times, over and over, and then quietly start the camera rolling, without the chief realizing it. Chief Dan George would get the dialogue about 90% right, and then improvise the rest, and sometimes that improvised piece was pure gold. That is how some of the film's most quoted moments came to life, including the line where Lone Watty dryly observes that when Josey starts disliking someone, they tend not to be around very long afterward. It wasn't fully scripted. It was an old man, trusted by a young director, being allowed to be himself. A 77-year-old's faulty memory became one of the warmest performances in Western history. But he wasn't the only towering figure on that set. There was a man on the cast who stood 6'7" and had once been a rodeo cowboy. Who was he? Number 5. The rodeo cowboy who became a chief on screen. The Comanche chief Ten Bears appears in only one scene, but it is the emotional spine of the entire film. The moment two enemies choose to live rather than die. The actor playing him was Will Sampson, and his real life was every bit as remarkable as the role. Samson was a full-blooded member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. He stood about 6 feet 7 inches tall, and before Hollywood ever found him, he was a working rodeo cowboy, riding broncs, and a genuinely gifted painter whose artwork was respected in its own right. He had been discovered almost by accident for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest just the year before, where he played the silent giant Chief Bromden. Josey Wales was one of his very first major roles after that breakthrough. Now, think about the strange beauty of that scene. A book written by a former Clansman gives us a moment where a hunted Confederate outlaw and a Comanche war chief sit across from each other and agree that there has been too much dying, that they will offer each other life instead of death. Those words came out of the imagination of Asa Carter, and they were brought to life by a proud Native American rodeo rider turned actor. The history behind that single scene is almost impossible to believe. Will Sampson died far too young, in his early 50s, after a long battle with illness. But his 10 Bears lives forever. Now that famous peace scene was high drama, but the detail audiences remember just as fondly is a lot less dignified. It involves a dog and a mouthful of tobacco. What was the story there? Number 6, the tobacco, the dog, and a cast of unforgettable faces. One of the most quoted habits of Josey Wales is the way he spits tobacco juice on things, on a scorpion, on a dead man, on a carpetbagger's coat, and most memorably on a mangy stray dog that keeps following him. That tobacco spitting was not some Hollywood invention. It came straight from the original novel, and Eastwood loved the frontier flavor of the character so much that he kept the author's strange, old-fashioned cowboy speech almost intact. Words like reckon and hoss sprinkled through the dialogue. The spitting became a running joke that audiences adored, a tiny piece of cussedness that made a legend feel human. And look at the faces around him, because this cast is a hall of fame of great character actors. The brutal Captain Terrell, leader of the Redlegs, was played by Bill McKinney, the same actor who had terrified audiences as the Mountain Man in Deliverance just a few years earlier. The smooth, conflicted Fletcher was John Vernon, whose deep rumble of a voice would soon make him famous as the villainous Dean in Animal House. The doomed young Jamie was Sam Bottoms, who would go on to play the surfer in Apocalypse Now. And in the heartbreaking opening, the little boy who is Josey's murdered son. That was Eastwood's own son, Kyle Eastwood, in his very first film appearance. A father directing the story of a man who loses his family and casting his real child as the son who dies in the first minutes. But where did all that grief and rage come from? The history behind Josey Wales was real, and it was brutal. Number 7. The real war behind the legend. Josey Wales is invented, but the nightmare he is born from absolutely was not. The film opens with Missouri farmers being slaughtered by Union raiders, and Josey riding off to join Confederate guerrillas in revenge. That world was real, and it was one of the ugliest chapters of the entire Civil War. Along the Missouri and Kansas border, irregular fighters waged a war of pure savagery. On the Confederate side rode the bushwhackers, men like William Quantrill, and the infamous Bloody Bill Anderson, who actually appears as a character in this film. On the Union side rode the Jayhawkers and the Redlegs, named for the red leggings they wore, the same Redlegs who hunt Josey across the picture. In 1863, Quantrill's raiders descended in the town of Lawrence, Kansas, and murdered around 150 to 200 men and boys in a single morning. The James brothers and the younger brothers learned their deadly trade in those very bands. So when Josey Wales says, at the end, that he reckons they all died a little in that damned war, he is speaking for thousands of real, shattered people. Eastwood understood this. He has called the film an anti-war story, and he made it during the long shadow of Vietnam, when America was aching over exactly the kind of wounds Josey carries. So the violence was rooted in truth. But what about the money? And the music that Hollywood almost gave an Oscar? That story has its own surprise. Number 8. The Bargain Budget and the Blacklisted Composer. By the standards of a major studio western, The Outlaw Josey Wales was made on a shoestring. The whole picture cost about $3.5 million, a remarkably lean figure even for 1976. And it went on to earn somewhere around $31 million, making it one of the top-grossing films of the entire year and one of Time magazine's 10 best. Eastwood's own production company, Malpazzo, made it, which is exactly why Eastwood had the power to fire his director in the first place. He answered to almost no one, and then there is the music. The haunting, folk-flavored score was written by Jerry Fielding, a brilliant composer with his own painful history. Back in the 1950s, Fielding had been blacklisted, his career nearly destroyed by the anti-communist witch hunts of that era. For Josey Wales, he dug into authentic Irish folk melodies from the Civil War period to give the film its mournful, rooted sound. That score earned Jerry Fielding an Academy Award nomination, the third and final one of his life, and the first Oscar nomination any film directed by Clint Eastwood had ever received. A man Hollywood once tried to bury helped give Eastwood's directing career its first taste of Academy Gold. The film was a hit. The music was honored, the legend was launched. But the praise that meant the most came years later, from one of the greatest filmmakers who ever lived. What did he say? Number 9. Orson Welles, The Lost Locations and a National Treasure. Years after the film came out, the legendary Orson Welles, the man behind Citizen Kane, sat on a talk show and said something that stunned people. Welles admitted he had watched The Outlaw Josey Wales 4 times. And he declared that it belonged with the great westerns, the masterpieces of John Ford and Howard Hawks. He even called Eastwood the most underrated director in the world at that time. For a young star still fighting the assumption that he was just a squinting tough guy, praise like that from Orson Welles was almost beyond price. The world Welles loved was built in some of the most beautiful country in America. The production filmed across the canyons near Lake Powell, in the Arizona desert, in Wyoming, in Northern California, and at a legendary movie ranch outside Kanab, Utah, a place nicknamed Little Hollywood. Sadly, much of that history is gone now. The ranch sets were battered by a flood and finally destroyed by a fire decades later. But Josey's homestead cabin was saved and moved to a small local museum where you can still stand beside it. And in 1996, the United States government gave the film its highest honor for a movie. The Library of Congress selected The Outlaw Josey Wales for the National Film Registry, marking it as a work that is culturally and historically too important to ever lose. Eastwood himself has said he thinks it is as good as, maybe better than, his Oscar-winning Unforgiven, a studio western with a fired director and a hidden Clansman behind it became a national treasure. But the strangest chapter of all came after the cameras stopped with the man who started it. Remember Forrest Carter? Number 10. The secret that outlived them all. Come back to where we began, because the author's story did not end when the movie did. It got stranger. The very same year Josey Wales hit theaters, an Alabama journalist who had known Asa Carter for years finally exposed him in print in the New York Times, asking flat out whether the gentle Cherokee storyteller Forrest Carter was really the notorious Clansman Asa Carter. The reporter recognized his voice over the phone. Carter denied everything to the end. And then Carter did something almost unbelievable. He wrote a second book, a tender memoir called The Education of Little Tree, about a Cherokee boy raised by his grandparents. He passed it off as the true story of his own childhood. For years, it was beloved. It won a major booksellers award. It climbed to the very top of the bestseller lists, and it was praised by readers and public figures all across the country, by people who had no idea it was the invention of a man who once wrote Segregation Forever. Only later did a historian prove, beyond doubt, the depth of the hoax. Asa Carter died in 1979 at just 53 in Texas. He was buried under his real name. And so the film you love carries a haunting double life. Its message of family, mercy, and peace between enemies was written by a man who spent his life spreading the opposite. Clint Eastwood, who might never have touched the project had he known the truth, took that poison source and turned it into one of the warmest films of his career, and made it endure for 50 years. A racist's words brought to life by a Native American chief. A love story that began in the desert and ended in a courtroom. A director fired into the history books. That is the secret life of the outlaw Josey Wales, and almost nobody believed it until now. If you enjoyed the untold story behind this classic, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. Because the real history behind the movies you grew up with is always stranger than the movies themselves.